All right, so hi everyone, and also folks joining us online or via recording. My name is Cody Mejeur. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Media Study at UB, and I direct the Amatryx Gaming Lab and Studio there, which was one of the primary organizers on this show. Thanks everyone for coming out today. I'm really excited to have a special guest speaker with us, Dr. Tina Rivers Ryan, who is curator at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. There's a lot of great information about Tina's fantastic work, both recently and currently, on the flyer. She encouraged me not to read out her CV, and I appreciate that because I also hate it when people do that to me. But I'm so honored that Tina's here today and sharing some thoughts to get us started with what will hopefully be a pretty conversational event to talk about the show and its themes. And I guess I would just sort of invite people to, as much as this is going to be sort of a bit of a curator talk, we also really want to hear from folks about your thoughts about things you've seen in the show or things that you experienced in your own lives with creativity during the pandemic as well, which was, broadly speaking, our theme for this show. But I'll be quiet now and hand it over to Tina. And please join me in welcoming Tina.
It's such an honor to be invited to be in dialogue with some of my favorite people and organizations here in the Buffalo arts community. My name is Tina Rivers Ryan. I'm a curator at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. I have the distinct pleasure of having worked with Cody before, Amatryx. Well, was it under the auspices of Amatryx or really as Buffalo Game Space?
It was Apollo Light Lab.
Oh, Apollo Light Lab, that's right. That's right. So in 2021, along with University at Buffalo art professor Paul Vanuz, I curated an exhibition called Difference Machines, Technology and Identity in Contemporary Art, which looked at the relationship between technology and identity, truth and advertising. And as part of the programming for that exhibition, Apollo Light Lab at the University at Buffalo that Cody was a part of facilitated a games workshop for our audience, and it was really just such an amazing thing to be able to realize that part of our vision for the exhibition, which was to really show people that working with media, making media art, is a very hands-on, accessible thing that people can do, right? Not just watch, but can participate and even make it. So thank you for that. And of course, Ekram from Squeaky Wheel is also here on stage with us. Ekram, well. I sort of want to say more personal things.
We hang out.
We hang out. We hang out. I will tell this story, even though this is not just for the people in this room. And I know it's going on the internet, which means it will live forever. But I have no shame. One of my best memories of Buffalo was the very first night I sort of went out after moving here. Was to a Squeaky Wheel event that was introducing the residents cohort. And I wound up standing on the sidewalk drinking Crown out of a red Solo cup, talking about the relationship between aesthetics and politics with Jatavia Gary. And I came home and I turned to my husband and I said, "I've found my people. This is it. I can be happy here in Buffalo." Thank you for that, Ekram, for that. Welcome to Buffalo.
Thank you.
And I've also had the distinct pleasure of serving as a juror for a Squeaky Wheels residency program. And Buffalo Art Studio, I don't believe that we've done anything officially together yet. It's not that I've been involved with personally, but...
Our involvement with the AKG has been largely with your public arts program. We hosted Amanda Browder's Sewing Days here. We also had our youth and college prep programs participate in the Tulay mural production. So, and then several of our artists, half a dozen of our artists or so, have been residents at the AKG.
And perhaps you should introduce yourself too.
Oh, I'm Shirley Verico.
Since I didn't introduce
Thank
you.
you. I'm Shirley Verico. I'm the curator and director of visual arts here at the Buffalo Art Studios.
Yeah, great. So thanks, Shirley. And it's just so wonderful to be up here with all three of you, colleagues and friends who make Buffalo so special. So we are here today to talk about a very special project, about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is this project called What We Made During the Pandemic, Marginalized Responses to COVID-19, which is a sort of complicated project that took my head a minute to wrap around, that is a physical installation here in the Tri-Main Center at Buffalo Art Studio, Buffalo Game Space, and Squeaky Wheel Film and Media Art Center. It is presented by Amatryx Gaming Lab and Studios, based out of the Department of Media Study at SUNY Buffalo, and co-curated by Jocelyn E. Marshall, Cody Claire Johnson, and Morgan J. Samet. And I'm just reading here about the exhibition, so I don't get anything wrong. This exhibition showcases intermedia work by BIPOC, queer, and Buffalo-based artists that they created during the pandemic. It is a satellite exhibition of creativity in the time of COVID-19, art as a tool for combating inequity and inequality, which is a public humanities collaboration between SUNY Buffalo and Michigan State University with the aid of a Mellon grant. So we are here today on the, is it the closing day? I believe it's the closing day.
We technically run through tomorrow, but
Okay.
today's our closing event. Yeah, so tomorrow's it.
So tomorrow's it. We're here to sort of celebrate this project, to wrap it up, at least this stage of, what we made during the pandemic, which is sort of the initial stage of this larger project, creativity in the time of COVID-19. And I wanted to begin by asking you guys some questions, and these are, well, at least the first one is really for Cody, and then the others, will be for all of us here on the stage. But before I go into those questions, I just wanted to offer a brief response to the project. And so for those of you who, well, hopefully everyone here has had a chance to see it in all three of its sort of iterations across Tri-Main. Yeah, for those who haven't seen it, it is a sort of sprawling exhibition that includes works in many different media formats. And so I just wanted to tease out for a second some themes that I saw as I passed through the exhibition. And the first one of those is the theme of portraiture and figuration, but specifically a kind of figurative practice that is about individual identity and the expression of individual identity. And as a sort of subset of that, very prevalent is self-portraiture. And so there's many, many images here in which we see artists representing themselves. And as a corollary of that, we have many images that are very familiar from art history as sort of the genre of the artist in the artist studio. So images of artists sort of in their studios, which in many cases now, before COVID and definitely during COVID and since COVID, the studio is of course the home. It is the bedroom, it is the living room. The bathroom sometimes. And so we see a lot of these very sort of intimate images, right? It's always intimate when you see an artist in their studio, but when that studio happens to also be their bed, that's a whole nother level of intimacy. And of course, there's a sort of truism in art history that one of the reasons that we see so many images of artists' own bodies is because it is the cheapest and most readily available model that they can find. Free, and you're always there. But of course, it raises a lot of philosophical questions as artists begin to explore their own identities through their artistic choices. And vice versa, right? So understanding how their artistic project and their own identity become commingled through the practice of self-portraiture. Relatedly, another theme that emerged, I think, is community. And sometimes the communities depicted, it is not entirely clear whether the person sort of behind the camera, so to speak, is a member of that community, and we're witnessing something that might be called an anthropological gaze, where a person is looking in on a community from the outside. But I think in many cases, it is quite clear that what we are seeing is a more intimate view of a person sort of witnessing a community to which they belong. I think, that is, again, something that we see, in art history, and especially, thinking since like the 1990s, the photographer Nan Goldin is sort of the poster child of this kind of artistic practice, where an artist turns the lens upon their community, their immediate peers. And then finally, a big theme I think that might emerge is world building, and it's certainly a word that was used in some of the language that you guys have produced around this project. The word utopia was also invoked, I noticed, in the language that you used around this project. And I think typically we associate world building with digital gaming, with the building of these digital worlds that have to be rendered so that we can inhabit them as players, as avatars. But we also might think of more traditional forms of artistic practice as also being a form of world building. And that sometimes world building is not just about creating, whole cloth, a world out of nothing. Sometimes it's about reframing the world around us in order to suggest an entirely different kind of world. Just sort of seeing it with new eyes, which is of course what artists are so good at. So as two examples of these kinds of themes, I just want to quickly point to two of them to make it kind of concrete. So one of them is right here in this room. So Michael Anthony DeAnda's project, Comfy Royalty. So Michael has knit these crowns, these very colorful crowns that you are invited to put on. And there is a mirror mounted on the wall, and above the mirror there is text that says, "Take a selfie with a crown!" exclamation point. So this is a project that, it basically emerges from an artist doing this, very personal task that we associate with craft, and it's sort of gendered, of course, in that way, but also is very much something that one does to pass the time, right? Thinking again of the pandemic, right? What you do in isolation to pass the time. It's a solitary activity. Not that it can't be social, but it can also be a solitary activity that one does to pass the time. But what Michael generates, right, is these crowns that you're invited to wear, and thinking of all of the sort of positive ideas about, celebrating oneself, right? Crowning oneself, celebrating oneself. And then the fact that you're invited to photograph yourself wearing this crown, right? To produce an image of yourself in this, wearing this crown in this sort of, self, I don't know if I want to say self-aggrandizing, but positive self-image, let's put it that way. And DeAnda actually has a statement and said about this project, "My goal in sending crowns to people," so I guess the crowns were also sort of distributed, was to highlight my admiration for them and give them cozy vibes through the accessory. So again, thinking of, not only portraiture and self-portraiture, inviting people to make their own images, to fashion the self, but also to create community, right? To share your feelings about somebody, about other people with them, to, express his admiration for them, and in doing so, build a community, right? Of people that, are his sort of chosen community, chosen friends. And then also to support them, right? A cozy accessory, something that might bring them warmth, bring, both literal and metaphorical, because again, these are very colorful, and so they sort of fill you with good vibes while keeping your head warm. The other project I want to highlight is a video by Tia Brown called Pendulum, which is not on view in this space, but is on view downstairs on the 3rd floor at Squeaky Wheel. And in this video, we see a solitary person on a swing, and the image it's in black and white, and it is mirrored across the vertical central axis. So kind of as in a kaleidoscope, what we see is the person swinging towards and away from themselves, and there are moments where they meet their own image and then merge into one, and then pull away and apart. And it's just a short video, but that's the full contents of the video, right? Is sort of swinging into and then coming apart. And it has all the things that I love about video art. It has, the mirroring effect. It has the sense of temporality. It has the loop. I love the high contrast with the black and white. It has a great soundtrack, as I recall. But as I watched it play out, I really thought, I just started thinking much more deeply about this sense of coming into yourself, falling out, like the sense of mirroring and doubles, and just, then thinking of that in the context specifically of the COVID-19 pandemic, and being alone and being lost in a kind of, the person that you see more than anybody else is going to be your reflection in the mirror, basically, unless you live with a partner or a friend or family. And even if you do, you might also see your reflection in the mirror more often, because at a certain point we all got sick of each other and needed to retreat into our bathrooms as our only safe solitary space. So anyway, so those are just two concrete examples of what I was talking about in terms of thinking about sort of portraiture, figuration, self-portraiture, community, world building, etc. So the final thing I sort of wanted to point out before I get into the questions is that I do think that something very beautiful happens in this show that, again, was touched on in some of the writing that was produced around it, which is that it really hits upon the paradox of our experience of creativity during the pandemic. And paradox is a word that the organizers used. They referred to the paradox where, on the one hand, we experience loss, and I think at this point, it almost doesn't need to be said, all of the different dimensions and registers of that loss. I mean, we watched people die. I lost 2 family members. I'm sure everyone has stories. but also, of course, loss of income, loss of community, loss of livelihoods, loss of careers, loss of, I mean, in many cases, people moved, right? So loss of home. But on the other hand, also, and this is again their phrasing, the joy of coming home or into oneself. And I think that there was, and you know, it's so nice to be reminded in a sense to sort of focus on the positive, that there was this flip side. I mean, not that there's ever a good time to have a global pandemic that kills tens of millions of people, but if there is a silver lining on that, right, it's that it did allow for a kind of reconfiguration of a lot of our lives, and I think a lot of people did come out of that having new communities, for example, or new ways of communing. So I'll give one example of this just to get very personal. A lot of my social network is also my professional network, and a lot of them are not here in Buffalo. Some of them are on the stage here with me, but a lot of them are not here in Buffalo. And normally I don't see those folks unless I physically get on a plane and go visit them in New York or London or Los Angeles. And so when the pandemic started, I started a monthly Zoom workshop for curators who work with media art. And it was basically an excuse to get together once a month and drink a bunch of red wine sitting on my couch and to talk about, you know, issues facing the curation of media art in institutional contexts. And it was lovely. And, you know, we have, you know, strengthened friendships and, you know, great ideas came out of that. And none of that would have happened if it wasn't for the fact that we were all sequestered. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that as another thing that I think the show is sort of about, that it's not only exclusively about the negative experience of COVID, about loss and death and alienation. It's also about sort of coming together, mutual aid and support, et cetera. So with that all said, as a preamble, I wanted to jump into my first question, which is that which has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned before, this project is only the first stage of a larger project that is looking at the nature of creativity and specifically how people have used creativity during the pandemic. And by people here, you mean both professional artists and also people who are making art for the first time or who are, you know, becoming creative for the first time. And I think the cliche of this is like, do you remember when everyone started baking sourdough? Like that was a thing all of a sudden. So everyone starts, you know, baking sourdough, everyone starts knitting, people take up crafts, and suddenly we have this amazing flourishing of like artisanal forms and habits that even now dominate my Instagram feed, you know? It's like Etsy gone wild all of a sudden, you know? So yes, you have this larger project that's about that. So I wondered if you could give us a little taste of sort of what you guys have found or think you might find in your sort of larger research project about creativity.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Tina. I really appreciate your comments too. I was thinking, and right before I answer your question, I'm going to be that unruly respondent that says something else first. But your comments made me think too about something that I don't think I had found the words to really say about this show yet, outside of maybe, you know, some of the writing we've done about it so far. But like another curious paradox about this show, I think, and a lot of the themes in it, is the weird form of like being alone together that we all did during the pandemic, right? Like where we experienced each other. Like Tina, I think I met you as a Zoom box, right? The first time, right? And so like we had these weird ways that we were alone, but we also found, like you said, new forms of community too. And I think in a lot of sort of the portraiture and the self-expression, like people, you know, taking pictures, painting, drawing themselves in this show, like I think it's really easy sometimes to, especially for my own untrained eye, to sort of look at that as like a form of almost narcissism, right? Of like, oh, look at me, I'm gonna, you know, do pictures of myself. But it's not that at all, right? Like it's a form of sort of individual expression that is also very communal. It's like, and I think that that's a really long-standing sort of message in a lot of, especially queer and trans communities too. Like I'm expressing myself and also empowering you to do the same, right? And so I think that anyway, some of those themes come through. It makes my heart sing to hear you say that those themes come through in the show, and then the brilliant work that these artists shared with us. But yeah,
Can I be an unruly respondent?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, because you just reminded me. I actually had my next note here. I cut to the questions too early. Was that I did want to call out that these topics of portraiture, community, and world building are of particular import to, first of all, the artists that you've worked with here, which is to say artists from marginalized backgrounds, right? That the stakes of fashioning the self, of building community, of building world and imagining utopias, that's something of particular import to artists who are from an LGBTQ or BIPOC background, et cetera. And then the second thing I wanted to call it is that it's also of particular import to those artists working with media art. And not everyone in this show is a media artist, but a major component of this exhibition was digital gaming and also digital video. And so I just wanted to call out that for artists working with media, one of the sort of inherent affordances of media technologies is the fact that they are collaborative and communal, and that they can be networked, et cetera. So yeah, just wanted to flag that. So thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that maybe that does kind of lead into one of the surprising, not surprising necessarily, one of my favorite words is serendipity. Maybe I'll use serendipity here, but so this is part of a larger project that spans multiple institutions. This is the first in a series of exhibitions taking place here, also at the Air Force Academy, at Michigan State, and also at University of Washington, St. Louis. Each place is sort of putting on an exhibition over the next year. And so this is part of like a bigger project, but though these exhibitions are really only step one in that project. From there, a lot of this art, at least the artists who want it to be, it will enter into an archive of pandemic artwork that will be housed at Michigan State. With our own exhibition, we also have a catalog that we're putting together that will be shared too to help the show sort of live on after it's done, which I'm excited that it's going to have that capacity too to still be a thing afterward. We received lots of submissions from all over the world. I definitely sort of, I think, a bias toward Anglophone countries, where I think that was where our messaging was strongest about, and our survey reached the furthest was in Anglophone countries around the world. But we received submissions from all over the world as part of this project. And in every different type of media, right? In a way that, at least so far, like in organizing these shows, it's been a real boon in that we get to show a real wide diversity of different creative practices. It's sometimes a little tricky so far to start drawing some trends through that, at least without more time to look more closely at the data that we have, just because there's so many different things. But I would say that my moment of serendipity, to go back to that word, was finding that we have a number of trans games that were submitted. And I mean, maybe this is just personally exciting to me because I teach game design and game studies. That's where my own work is. But to like have sort of a critical mass of trans games be submitted was a really sort of wonderful moment of, and of course I was familiar with my own work that, people have been making trans games for years, but they can still, you're not used to like that being something that you get to meet and see other people doing it all the time, right? It's pretty rare that you get to see, oh yes, there's a number of us doing this, and now in the show we can share multiple trans games in the same space, and that was really exciting to me, right? I think that seeing that community emerge even in this exhibition and bringing together these artworks was that was very exciting to me.
I have another question. We agreed that this is just going to be organic. I have some questions that are written down, but we're just going to go with the flow here. And so building off of that, actually, I wanted to ask you about this notion of empathy. So again, in the writing around the show, you guys cite Anthropy, and who sort of resists this idea a little bit that that digital games are about providing a kind of empathy for non-trans people to access trans people's experiences. And correct me if I'm, need to nuance that or flesh that out a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, I've just been fascinated for so long by this idea that, that games, but also particularly forms of augmented and virtual reality, can inculcate empathy, can teach people how to walk in somebody else's shoes. We see this idea promoted a lot by the major corporations that are developing VR tools for Hollywood and for sort of the military research industrial complex. And I know there's a great body of literature now pushing back against that. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what trans gaming means, in the context of not only this debate around empathy, about games and empathy, but also COVID-19 and a pandemic, right? Where what we saw, a large part of people's experience of that pandemic relates to this question of like, are you able to empathize with others? How do we empathize with others? Who is the other? And I mean this in many dimensions, from Donald Trump trying to call it a Chinese virus to the sort of like breakdown of public discourse that we've seen accelerated over the past few years, et cetera. So yeah, it's a very big.
It is, but it's a very real question. It's one that, like, me and the team, like my lab's own game that is part of the show is Trans Folks Walking. It's a game that's an anthology of trans stories. In making that game, we've talked about this for a number of years now, right? I think Tina, I might have even mentioned it when you invited us to do that AKG and conversation event too. But I'm very skeptical of empathy in that, and the phrase I always think about, and I first heard this in a talk that Lisa Nakamura gave, a brilliant scholar at U of M. She shared this quote that was, if you're walking a mile in someone else's shoes, that means you've stolen someone else's shoes. And I think that captures a bit of, like, for me, where the limits of empathy are is, if you have to approach everything and make it personally relevant for you to care about it, then I think that there's a real limit to that, right? It sort of requires a packaging and boxing up of other people's lives and stories so that you can hopefully get other people to care about them. But at the same time, I do understand that, like, empathy can do good work as well, right? And within the context of the pandemic, I think that just the skill of giving a shit about other people, I think that empathy can play a role in hopefully building that capacity for people. And certainly that's something that people talk about with art all the time, right? Like, oh well, this is what art can do, right? It can build our capacity to care about the human condition and each other. And as skeptical as I am of that, sometimes I do see some power there, right? Something that can come out of that. So I don't want to throw empathy away entirely, but I think of it as sort of like a secondary motivator for like the work that at least my team's doing. Where if people approach our game and they learn something about what it's like to be trans in a particular place, if they get a better understanding of that, or they get an increased capacity to care about others after playing the game, great. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad outcome, but that's not what we're making the game for, right? It's not our primary motivator, and what our primary motivator is to create community. I think of myself as a LGBTQ teenager and in a very rural place where I didn't know other LGBTQ people. And I just really needed to know that there were other people out there like me, right? And find connections with them. And I think that's more what I think of as a primary motivator for the work, is like, I want it to be a place where people can find each other, find stories like theirs, and hopefully, be again empowered to share their own stories too, in whatever form they want to.
Thank you for sharing that Lisa Nakamura quote. That's going to stay with me forever. I will give you credit for having relayed it. I think it's something that all of us who work, who are sort of cultural workers in the arts, have to think about, right? Is, what exactly are we hoping to achieve by putting diverse stories on view, right? And it's one thing to say, well, we're going to teach people to like people who aren't like themselves. It's another thing to say, we're going to allow people to see themselves reflected in this space and to find their own community, right? Those are two different objectives. And I think it's important to sort of tease them out when we're talking about goals. Great, so moving on to a question that is sort of for everyone here, sitting up here. I wonder if we could talk a little bit from our perspectives, because, well, at least three of us up here aren't primarily identified as artists, but as cultural workers, as curators. How has the pandemic impacted the work that we do? Which I hesitate to call creative, but I guess really kind of is. We're not making art, but we're making exhibitions. And so in a sort of immediate sense, I'm curious about how the pandemic might have impacted the organization of this show. But I also hope that all of us can speak to, you know, how things have changed now. Just thinking about why somebody, you know, might be wanting to watch this talk, and what they might get out of it, is to think about what has changed for creativity for artists, but also for other people working with artists.
Yeah, I can start with that one. So it's really interesting as you see that as we're looking, those who will see this online are watching a video made with my own phone on a tripod with a mic system that Buffalo Art Studios probably would not have had if there had not been COVID. We are an art gallery, we are classes, we do have some media, but we weren't really doing Facebook Live events or things of that nature. We're a small team with an enormous space, and that has provided limited us. But also when you talk about community, we do feel really strongly about our community. And it meant that we had to learn how to connect and stay connected with our community alone or apart. And so for us, we just dove in, which is the Buffalo Art Studio way. We made some really bad Facebook Live events where the phone was sideways, the sound was terrible, but you know, we showed up. And we showed up because connecting was more important than doing it perfectly. And I think that's a theme I see in this exhibition. I think about the crowns. I think that there was some liberation during COVID of having to be great at things or just doing them. I think about social media. I think about all of these places where it was new to everybody, so everybody was allowed to make mistakes and everybody was allowed to kind of make bad sourdough bread. And I think that there was some liberation to that. And so for us as an institution, we learned a ton. I would have, if you had said to me 5 years ago that we would be speaking on wireless mics off of a 4-channel, I would have said, you're crazy. That's squeaky wheel shit. That's not Buffalo Art Studio stuff. We'll never be doing that. And here we are. So I think that that's something that happened for us. We wanted to be able to present our work. We still have a lot of people that don't feel comfortable coming to an opening because there's a lot of people here. So we now do our best to do a great job filming and presenting artist talks, because that only happens live in this really short amount of time. So we now capture that and preserve it. And I think, and just to loop back, I think that's something else that we're doing as galleries, and giving not just a place for these voices, these traditionally underrepresented voices to be heard, but for those voices to be preserved. So when I hear that you're making a catalog, that means a lot, because I think it isn't just that these folks made these things, these games, that even if the crowns disappear, there's going to be a record of the making of the crowns. There's a record of the wearing of the crowns. And I think that is important, as we see now as there's attempts to rewrite history in different parts of this country to negate experiences. So I think that's really, really important about your project and really important about what we're all doing. So I would like to add that to the conversation about things like empathy and what we can do. We can not only give voice, but we can say, yeah, that voice was here, and we're going to make sure that voice is recorded and preserved.
We're a media arts center, but I can tell you our first videos were pretty rough. Our first online videos. But I think similarly, and at this point we have a pretty big commitment to have, like this fall, all of our screenings and all of our events will also be hybrid. Our residency program, we switched it to remote during the pandemic, and we continue to offer a remote option for people who don't feel comfortable traveling due to the continuing pandemic. And I think, at least sort of like as an administrator, budgeting, one of the voices I listened to most closely, certainly in the beginning parts of the pandemic, were a lot of sort of disabled people being like, oh, now you all want to, now it's okay to stay home. Now it's okay to do, and they're right, of course, So I think it's also, like at least administratively, budgeting access services much more directly into my programs, even ahead of artist fees and sometimes usually matching artist fees. So I think those are the sort of main things overall.
I was enjoying listening to you guys so much, I forgot I was moderating for a second. I was like, wait, go on. Maybe this is a good time to open it up. We have a small but powerful audience here in person with us. So if anybody has any comments or questions they want to add about the exhibition or about creativity in this moment of the COVID pandemic. Otherwise, I have more and I can keep going for a couple more minutes, but I don't want to take all the
time. Can you hear me? Or yeah, okay. Great. So thank you so much. All of these are so amazing. I actually wanted to ask Ephraim to talk more about the role of access in the exhibition itself. And I mean, Cody, but also this idea, the fact of visual descriptions being added to every one of the pieces, that this is, I think it's true, it's the catch-up. This is finally a sort of moment of catch-up, but that it's really now become a really important kind of, and I think honestly, Ephraim, like one of the first things you said, the Squeaky, that some of those videos were rough, but you also invented a new medium as the first online screening with the Google Doc interview, live Google Doc interview, which was brilliant and there's a document of this live Google Doc conversation. So a new form was invented by a curator. A creative curator. But I did want to bring up the question about access for one main reason, or a number of reasons, but is because I think this idea about framing and structures becoming visible is really significant, because what this project did, and even in its strange unwieldiness of the complex form that you referred to, Tina, of being on 3 floors, of having a future online component, and of that it's moving and all of these things, the edges are unclear, right? Or they're not so much unclear, they're porous and they're expanding and contracting at different moments. And that, for me, feels like that's actually one of the roles that we saw kind of actually displayed for us as part of social life, creative life. This people who make spaces and systems and edges and boundaries and masks and things like that. And we saw how few we have that work. And so there's something profound about having this kind of lovely growing machinery that made and captured some of the creative energies, and that is building on it, right? That is now its own structure, this interaction, right? These connections, these people. Now the sense of, oh, right, I can find people who are going to make containers for my work, right? And it's not just Facebook and Instagram, right? There are other platforms that need to be made or connected in order for creativity to circulate and feed people. So that was a comment, not a question, obviously, whatever. But then I wanted to go back to the edges, the structures that don't work, and the idea of building on what we do have and best practices from communities, and the ways in which, partly it's a question for Shirley, but it's also a question for Tina, which is, I feel like this is a moment where institutions can't get away with not answering the call for access for hard of hearing, for every level of disability. And that this is a moment where, I don't know, I have to say that Squeaky Wheel has been a tremendous model in every institutions on every level. And Ekram, you are responsible for that in a large part because you have partnered, right, and learned from people. But it's you know, and part of a community that's been really embracing that. But I wanted to ask both institutions or representatives of these institutions to talk some about that, about how that is getting answered and continued, right? Because there's the gesture of acknowledgement that becomes a line on the website, and then there's actively building that into programming and development, not an occasional line or an afterthought on the budget, but becomes part of how one builds an understanding of the community for arts, all of these things. So I guess the way I would control it if I was moderating would be to ask you to talk about your own practice with it, and then to ask these two like these sort of representatives to.
Well, I would certainly, first of all, I would extend my gratitude to our past residents, Emily Watlington, Jordan Lord, we have an upcoming exhibition with, and also other artists like Carolyn Lazard, who wrote the great book, Arts and Accessibility, A Promise and a Practice, which is sort of accessibility guide for small arts organizations. I also want to emphasize, like, most of the things we are doing aren't necessarily perfect. It's with limited knowledge. You know, we are, at the end of the day, a small, underfunded arts organization. You know, sometimes okay funded, but usually, you know, there's never enough money, right? Yeah, just want to emphasize that there's still a lot of work that I want to do and that I'm looking forward to doing, but also sort of like, you know, just today even noticing that there's a weird way that images are embedded on our website where you can't access the alt text on it, and I'm like, what on earth is wrong with this website? So things of that nature. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us in this building, it's really interesting because those who are seeing this as a video later, Buffalo Art Studio and this exhibition in Squeaky Wheel are in Tri-Main. Tri-Main Center is a 600,000 square foot building with 100 plus tenants. Many of them are service organizations. So some of what we're talking about isn't in theory. We have a partnership with Aspire of Western New York, which serves varied ability to adults, many of whom require assistance, whether it's cognitively or physically. They actually have studio space within our facility. They enter our space every day. So we are very aware of making certain if we're having an installation that we are not just ADA compliant in theory, but the dozens of folks that come through every month in a wheelchair or some other assistance are able to get through, and it's very real for us. We have the Deaf Services is in our building. We also have St. Mary's School for the Deaf just down the street. So this is, we definitely don't do the job I wish we could do with things like wall text and labeling. That is, as Ekram said, you know, for an organization of our size, which is 20,000 square feet, we do about a dozen exhibitions a year, and we're a staff of 5. We also have a huge education program, but we are, even our education program does do a lot to serve varied ability youth. So we could always do better, but I do think, even back to this empathy question, you know, this isn't theory for us. It's here, it's real, it's every day. We're serving human beings. And some of those human beings interact with art differently than others of those human beings. So that's really our approach. I would love, love, love to see some of the big funders, either regionally or nationally, support initiatives to help organizations get the resources they need to do a better job and to pay everybody involved. Because the other thing I can't do is go downstairs to Deaf Services and ask them to provide assistance for free for us, because they're in exactly the same boat we're in. So I know we could do better. I would love to do better, and I would love someone or a coalition to provide the resources so we could, you know, go ask the people who know what we don't know to help us, and to help us responsibly and compassionately and, you know, with expertise to meet the needs. We know we're falling short, but I am proud of the work that we do, and I'm proud that there are so many folks in our community that feel welcome here, that feel comfortable here, you know, coming to us as they are.
Yeah, I love that you said like the people, you know, because like I think the same way, where it's like I know 2 or 3 people who Flickr films are going to bother them. So I'm like, okay, if I know if they're going to come in, I know a couple, you know, I know who's going to need a seat, you know, just like knowing the people who are coming through our doors is exactly not making it theoretical. You know, so thank you for saying and pointing that out, because it can be easy to get lost in the woods, you know. And it's like, why not just focus on exactly who's here?
So there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. I'm going to try to be somewhat brief. So, you know, it's at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum, thinking about accessibility now is built in to everything that we do from the ground up. We have on staff an accessibility coordinator who's worked there. I don't know exactly when she came into that role, but it was before I started there 6 years ago. I think it's been at least a decade. We have amazing access programs for people from various backgrounds to be able to come in and experience the museum. We have specialized tours for different communities. But we think about this really from inside out, top to bottom. For example, the art that we're acquiring, I can point to 2 recent artists who've been acquired into the collection. One of them is Park MacArthur. The other one that was mentioned already is Carolyn Lazard. So we're acquiring works so that we can have artworks to present to our audiences here that will sort of foreground the conversation around disability and access. Internally, you know, it's a super high priority along with all of our other DEAI work. One thing that I love that we've actually started doing is to get us caught up on our alt text descriptions. We have these, and I think it's okay for me to say this publicly, but we have these semi-regular meetings where we all get together and we just have a marathon of writing those. So like we'll all get together and just like have snacks and it's not just the curators and it's not just the access coordinators, it's everybody from across the museum. And you know, understanding that this is something that needs to get done, and also understanding that it should actually be something that we all are invested in and not just fall upon one particular person, namely our access coordinator, right? This is work that all of us need to be doing all of the time. You know, during the pandemic, like many organizations, we did experiment a lot with online programming that we hadn't done before. And we were all, I think, really excited about this for a couple reasons. One is that it not only increased our accessibility to the disabled community, but also to every other community as well. There are many people who, for geographic reasons, economic reasons, et cetera, can't make it to Elmwood Avenue on Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Because they're caretakers or because the buses don't run there in an efficient way or what have you. Again, I feel like I don't want to just like give a laundry list of everything that we're doing that's so great, but I think it is something that we're going to continue to think about. Certainly, I was going to make a joke earlier that, I was like, is your question about NFTs? When you were talking about experimenting with new ways of like sharing art and getting art out there and supporting people. But it wasn't about NFTs. But certainly as somebody who's particularly interested in media art, or let's just say file-based art, to be a little bit more descriptive and concrete. File-based art meaning artwork that exists and circulates, is stored, archived, and shown as the expression of a digital file, digital asset. The internet exists now, and so trying to think more about what it means to present art online, and obviously there are limits to this when it comes to physical objects, but for file-based artworks, there might be limits for that as well. There are certain artists who insist that I'm not going to name names, but my video can only be shown on a Panasonic projector of X number of lumens, and you can't do anything else with it, But a lot of other media artists are very agnostic when it comes to the hardware that their work needs to be shown on, or the scale, or the resolution, et cetera. So there's no reason why we can't let people just experience it on their screens at home when it comes to that. So that's one of the reasons why in 2022 we offered our first ever fully online exhibition, which was called Peer to Peer, which was an exhibition that was actually sort of presented in partnership with another website called Feral File. And I just love that name, Feral File. It already, if you were to come up, look up art museum in the dictionary and then went to antonym, it would be feral file, right? That is the opposite of an art museum. A file that's feral and runs wild and wants to be distributed everywhere is the opposite of the sort of the museum as mausoleum as a vault. But anyway, it's definitely something that we're thinking about more. I will just say that other museums, also have been doing incredible work. My dear colleague Jay Malika at the Perez Art Museum in Miami just launched a new initiative called PAM TV, which is a new online video streaming platform where PAM is screening video works from their collection in curated exhibitions that you can just go watch for free on the internet. And they're actually hoping to use it not only to screen PAM's own video collection, but to actually become a platform with channels for other institutions to be able to share their file-based artworks, or at least even more narrowly, single channel video artworks. So I think that there's a bit of a frustration sometimes on the part of the public that the change hasn't happened more quickly. Obviously, we were dynamic and responded to COVID in a sort of short-term sense by streaming video online and things like that. And now there's been a little bit of a retreat from some of that as we all have returned to prioritizing our in-person visitors, which I don't think it's I think it's pretty obvious for me to state has a lot to do with sources of revenue and income. But I don't think that we have completely forgotten about or retreated from these alternative models for exhibiting art. I just think that we're talking now about institutional changes that are going to take several years to implement. So for example, to cite the screening of video art online, it's not such an easy thing, because when we acquired those works, we didn't necessarily also acquire from the artist the right to publish that material on the internet. So we would have to retroactively go back and have conversations with those artists. And I think that people who don't work in museums or don't work with artists don't understand that. They're like, well, you own it, just put it on your website. And it's like, we actually don't legally have the right to do that necessarily. There's lots of other sort of questions that then need to get worked out. Unintended consequences. In that workshop that I mentioned earlier, that I was sort of organizing for media art curators, one of the things that came up was that we have found that when we do publish content online and don't make it time limited, people don't access it because there's no sense of urgency. So a special exhibition, it's on view for 3 months, you got to go see it, versus the permanent collection, it's there, whatever, you don't prioritize it, right? So how many of us, if you're fortunate enough to be able to travel and to go to a museum, for example, you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, you go see the special exhibitions, you may not make time to go see the permanent collection because it's always there, So then the question becomes, well, then do we have to institute, time limits on these things? But then that's sort of against the spirit of the internet, and everyone will just download it anyway. And then, I don't know. So, it's complicated. And just to say that these are not institutional changes that are going to be implemented overnight or even in a 12-month time period, right? They have, you're talking about contracts, which means you're talking about registrars, which means you're talking about collection care management protocols, which, it's just you're also talking about IT needs, like server space. I think people think that large organizations like museums just have money coming out the ear sometimes, or I don't know. It's some things are easier to fundraise for than others, and it turns out funding a server closet that you put your name on maybe isn't as sexy as some other things that you can put your name on. So although if anyone out there does want to fund a server closet, please contact me.
Or me.
So it's just to say it's complicated, but it's something important. So to acknowledge the part of your question that was about the breakdowns or where things don't work, right? And I think that's one sort of limit, is the technological limit of that museums in particular are not institutions that are set up to have the technological infrastructure to support these kinds of sort of online networking, screenings, et cetera, that we saw emerging out of the COVID pandemic on a permanent basis. Yeah. So I have so much more I could say about that, but
I want to build on that a little bit too. One of the things that we found is that hybrid was brutal. We could do a Facebook Live event, or we could do an actual live event, but trying to do both at the same time was beyond any of the technology we had, and it was really beyond the physical human being energy that we had. So we found ourselves having to make that choice. So it's something like this. We found that what we can do is a video. When we were totally at home, we would do Facebook Live events, and we would actually have someone on the other side of the phone reading the questions and looping it back. What we found when we had an actual audience here, our sound wasn't good enough for that. We just found that we couldn't do the both things simultaneously well. We would love, and you talked about barriers, we'd love to get to that place. We're not there yet, because I think a lot of this comes back to, when I think back to COVID and to this exhibition, we found ourselves asking questions we never thought we were going to have to ask. And I think, we all shouldn't beat ourselves up, nor should anyone, that we don't have answers yet. We came up with the answers that we had to, sort of in priority of survival mode, and I think for many people it was, how do I live in my house and not harm my spouse? I will make sourdough. For some of us it was all different things, but we found ourselves, I think all of us, asking questions, and I think a lot of that does show in the art and in the games and in the experience of the exhibition. But I think when you talk about institutional, we're all living that as well. Big institutions have to ask a lot of people to approve a lot of different answers to those questions. Smaller institutions may have an answer but not the funding to address it. So if that's another way to look at what you were asking.
And one thing to add to hybrid events is that you are essentially producing two events at the same time. And I have heard and see funders expecting even that more. But not necessarily without providing the funds to do it. And I also, know sufficient artists who aren't interested in doing online programs anymore. Or they don't feel that their work is appropriate for online. So really, it's always a negotiation, at least on our end and so on. And when we're talking about duration, the reason why all our screenings are 24 hours is because our artist fees don't reflect. We're not a streaming venue like Netflix is, for example, for streaming. So we can't necessarily provide those kinds of artist fees. So we try to keep it. We make offers that we think is consummate with what we can offer people.
Cody, did you want?
Yeah, I did kind of want to jump in, and particularly because I've been hearing echoes of it, I think, in what we're talking about. And this point is related to the experience of organizing this show and this grant project over several years. I think the nice public-facing perfect version of that is, well, we went from point A to point B, and it was nice and direct. It was great the whole time. That is not at all what happened. Of course not. There were lots of moments where things didn't work. There were moments when it was hard to get a hold of people. It was all online, right? There were times when people disappeared for weeks, sometimes months. And it was sometimes it was they were sick. Sometimes it was they had lost a family member. Sometimes they just didn't have the spoons for it, right? I find myself using that phrase a lot lately. I don't know why. But there were all of these things that I think if I had to put a point on what I think became really necessary in organizing this show and in the pandemic more broadly, it was giving each other grace, knowing that sometimes people, aren't going to be entirely on the ball. Sometimes people are going to be sick. Sometimes people are going to lose people. Sometimes people are going to die. And having that be something that we actually paused, at least for a moment, and acknowledged and made space for. And I think Tina, you commented on this a few minutes ago, but that's something that I really hope does not go away. I don't want that to go back to business as usual, where it's well, yeah, sorry you were sick, but get back to work. Or oh, well, sorry you were overwhelmed and couldn't work on this, but back to work. I want that sort of those moments of grace, those opportunities of grace to continue, because I think that they have to. I think it's really unjust if they don't. And I think that that ties to the, doing events and them not going super well, right? Like giving grace for those moments, right? Of like, well, but we did it, right? We found moments of connection still. There were moments pulling the show together that were very much the same sort of thing, right? Like, well, that wasn't exactly how we thought that would go, but it worked, and being okay with that. And I think that that actually kind of ties in with the accessibility too. I really have to shout out that the accessibility you see in this show with the QR codes, with the audio descriptions, none of that would have happened without our partners, particularly DisArt, which is a disability arts organization, and also Michigan State also provided a lot of labor in putting those QR codes together too. And so like it was having those partners that allowed us to do that. If it was just Amatryx doing that, there's no way we would have had capacity to do QR codes on top of everything else we were already doing. But in working with DisArt, the things we learned along the way, and I think this relates back to things people have already said too, are like, if you want to have an accessible anything, that has to be part of your planning early on, right? Like you get into really bad spaces when it's something you tack on at the end. But if you plan for it from the beginning, if that's like a core value of what you're doing, then that works. But also, you're not going to be perfect about it, right? That was something that we heard repeatedly from DisArt, and I'm so grateful to work with them. But they said, repeatedly, this isn't about being perfectly accessible. That's not what this is about. This is about doing as much as you can with what you have to make it as accessible as possible, right? And I think maybe that keeps with, do what you can with what you have, but also have some grace too. And yeah, anyway, so I think that was a point that I really took away from this.
And perfectly feeds into what I was going to say, which is to wrap up this program, just a final note to say that, I really appreciate, Cody, the work that you and all of your colleagues and collaborators did to pull together this project, because it is so timely. I think that we are just starting now to see a sort of a reckoning, whether we want to or not. I know those of you who teach at the university level are now dealing with the reckoning of having students come in who maybe didn't have the kind of preparation that previous generations have had in high school for collegiate level work. We're seeing a reckoning of this in the workforce now. I think the union, the strikes that have been happening this past month is another form of reckoning that we're having at a societal level, right, with people's sort of tolerance for different labor conditions. Priorities have shifted, right? And so I think we're just starting, while it seems like, in fact, everyone sort of has their head in the sand about a lot of this, like, why have so many people disappeared from the workforce all of a sudden? What happened? It's like, well, they're all underground. That's what happened. But anyway, that reckoning is now happening, and it's certainly something I opened, I didn't explain this comment, but I opened at the beginning by saying, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and that's because I do, very much care about, creativity, of course, but also thinking a lot about disability and thinking about sort of just reckoning with what has happened and acknowledging that, as somebody who's works in the contemporary art is a reflection of contemporary life, and contemporary life for the past 2 years, this pandemic has touched every aspect of our existence in ways that, we reflected upon in real time, but already seem to be falling into the rearview mirror. But I feel like actually it's just, I don't know what the 5 stages of grief are supposed to be, but I feel like we're doing it all sort of out of order. And like the anger, I think, is coming still. And I think we're like in denial right now or something, and I don't know. So this is just to say, thank you for doing this important and timely exhibition, and I think it's only going to be sort of, unfortunately, more timely in the near future because, again, not to be a total downer here, but like long COVID is real. We're seeing a mass disabling event, and to the question about sort of access, right? Access is only going to become more urgent, not just because, our priorities have shifted, but more and more people actually will not be able to partake in our programs as time goes on. And I'm not a scientist, but it's not Florida, so I feel like I can say something like that out loud. Here in New York State, at least for now, that like COVID is real and long COVID is real, and this is part of the important process that we need to do as a society, right, to reckon with that. So thank you for shining a spotlight on how the pandemic did shift, and also how we coped with it, right? Coping through creativity. That's sort of like the mantra of this project, right? So how we dealt with that. and we'll continue to deal with it, even though it seems like it's over in some sense, but it's not really. So thank you so much, Cody, and the rest of the Amatryx team for organizing it, and thank you so much to Buffalo Art Studio and Squeaky Wheel for hosting it, and Buffalo Game Space for sharing this show with us.
I believe Buffalo Game Space is open right now. If anyone wants to swing down there and take a last look at the games, they're open, I believe, until 7, so there's about 40 minutes left, but they are open if you want to swing down there and see that yet.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks for coming, everybody.